Thanks, Rick. If you have your Bibles, and I hope you do, turn with me to Proverbs chapter 15. And in just a moment, we're going to look at one verse there in Proverbs chapter 15. After putting the kids to bed the other night, Jenny came back downstairs. I'd put Silas to bed. She'd put Ella to bed. Jenny came back downstairs, and she said, "Hey, do you really think it's a great idea to teach our son to gamble while playing Uno?" I thought it was probably a fair question. You see, Ella likes to play Uno, and so of a night it would kind of become our family routine. You play 2 games, and then you'd kind of go off and do the bath and the bedtime thing. But over time, Silas kind of got bored with the game, and so he stopped playing. And it's not nearly as fun without the 4 of us, and so we like to make it a family ordeal. And so I had to find a way to motivate Silas into playing the game. And so it was really easy at first. I mean, it's what any father would do. I just began to trash talk him. And somehow it never came up, do you really think it's smart to teach our son to trash talk via Uno? But and so I would just say, hey, are you scared to play? Do you not, Daddy's going to win and all that? And then he would come and play the game, right? Well, after a few weeks, that just kind of lost its luster. And so I needed to up the ante a little bit. And so one Friday night, Ella wanted to play, and I said, sure, and Silas, come play. And he said, I don't want to. And I said, what if we do this? What if you or Ella wins, you get to go to bed 15 minutes later? But if me or Mommy wins, you have to go to bed 15 minutes earlier. And he goes, great, let's go. And so he came in there, and we played, and I won, and he went to bed 15 minutes earlier, and he didn't like it. But he's a competitive boy. I don't know where he gets that from. And so he's a competitive boy. And so the next night, he was ready to go, and he wanted to play again, and he played again, and he lost, and he went to bed 15 minutes early. And the third night, he played again, and he lost, and he went to bed 15 minutes early. And the fourth night, he didn't want to play. Well, like any other addiction, once you reach a level, you have to up the possible reward. And so I wanted to teach this to my 8-year-old. And so I said, well, Silas, how about if tonight, if you win, it's 30 minutes later? But if me or Mommy wins, it's 30 minutes earlier. And he said, okay, and he played, and he lost. And after going to bed 30 minutes earlier, Jenny came downstairs and said, hey, do you think it's a good idea to teach our son gambling via Uno? And I said, I don't care, they're already in bed. 30 minutes earlier. It's one of my, now what Silas didn't realize is that I haven't taught him this either, is the reason I always win is because I sit next to Ella, and she doesn't hide her cards because she doesn't care about winning. So not only is it 2 against 1, but one of the ones is actually cheating. I expect Jenny to come downstairs someday soon and say, do you really think it's a good idea to teach our son to lie via Uno? One of the things I love about parenting and love about marriage and love about relationships in general is you get this other person that comes from a different background, has a different experience, sees the world differently, has a different perspective than you, actually gets to hear the words that you can only say and speak. And what I love about marriage and relationships is they can step into your life and they can give you a different perspective. Whereas you thought it was so clear, it was so obvious, or you never even realized that, hey, maybe what you're doing is not going to go down the path that you want it to go down. And you have this other person that's there almost as a safeguard to say, hang on, buddy, are you sure? Do you recognize what's going on here? And yeah, it's playful fun right now, but is it possible that the path that you're going down is not one that you want to go down? One of the greatest things about friendship, about being brothers and sisters in Christ, about marriage, about co-parenting with another person, is you have this person that loves you, that desires what's best for you, and they can step into your life and say, hang on, maybe your perspective isn't the whole perspective. Maybe there's actually more to the story. One of the things that I absolutely hate about relationships, I mean love. One of the things I absolutely love about relationships is that somebody can step in and say that you're wrong. Have you thought about this? Have you thought about this direction? And it's one of the greatest benefits of marriage, but it's one of the greatest frustrations of marriage. It's one of the greatest benefits of friendships. It's also one of the greatest rubs of friendships. It's one of the greatest benefits of being a member of the family of God. but it's also one of the most tension-filled moments. Communication is difficult. I'll never forget. Jenny and I had started dating at Oklahoma Baptist, and so we came back here, and so she's from about an hour away, and so we went down to meet her parents, and then she was going to come up and meet my parents, and so we went down there first, and it went great. I mean, it went great. I mean, who else would you want to bring home to a hardworking American farming family other than a seminarian? And so, I mean, it was a great experience. They loved me, as you know that they would. As a matter of fact, I still remember one thing that her dad said is I just never dreamed that God would bring a man like that into your life. And so clearly he loved me greatly. I don't think he said it with that tone. Never dreamed how God could bring a man like that into your life. I think is actually what he said. But either way, you know what he meant. And so we had this great experience. I mean, they had never seen hands so soft or wit so strong. And so we just had this great experience down there. And then I brought Jenny up here. And that went great as well. My parents had never met a girl before. And so they were just amazed. They were just amazed that God would bring anybody into my life. And so we had a great time, and they were hopeful, and they started making wedding plans and all those kind of stuff. And so we had a great experience. We were driving down Rogers Avenue, and as we're driving down Rogers Avenue, I'll never forget right where we were. We're driving down Rogers Avenue, and this car, and the car, I mean, it's just not as clean as it needs to be, and just it not following, basic traffic laws. And, the car has a green tag on it. I mean, the car, and, and so they cut me off. And I'm a laid-back guy. It doesn't really bother me that much. And so I just kind of crack a little joke about a green tagger. And I'll never forget, I never knew a head could snap that quickly as it did from my passenger seat, where my LaFleur County wife, soon-to-be wife, although at the moment it was in doubt, snapped her head and said, "What did you say?" At which point I tried to think, what words kind of sound like green tagger, and there was really, nothing would come to, come to my mind. And so I said, well, in Arkansas, we play this little fun game where we make fun of Oklahoma drivers. And she goes, "You do what?" It blew her mind. Like she was in this other planet that she had never seen before. She couldn't fathom any concept in which Arkansas would ever make fun of Oklahoma for anything, right? And I'm looking at her who is this woman? And she's looking at me what is this? Not even who is this man, but what is this thing now before me? We're driving down the road, and our relationship, which has been going on for a year, but yeah, if you ask her, it was 2 months. It had been going on for some time, was almost over in that moment because we didn't even know each other anymore. Apparently in Oklahoma, they make fun of us. I didn't know that. And she didn't know that this whole time we had been making fun of them. She thought we only made fun of Mississippi. She didn't know how that worked. Her mind was blown. In that moment, we saw a small glimpse of what can be good in marriage, what can be good in relationships. Suddenly, you can get this perspective from somebody else that you never even ever considered. And it can change the words that you say. I've never said green tagger again until first service this morning, and I still don't think she liked it. But you get this different perspective. It begins to change your words, and it changes everything. Jenny, we'll go home on a Sunday afternoon, and we'll kind of begin to reflect and review what's going on. She's very cautious about critiquing this time and this moment because she understands it's a very vulnerable time. But I might bring it up. I might ease into the conversation so she feels that it's safe. And so I might try to be, fishing for a compliment, like, hey, wasn't that fun today? Or God honoring today? Or just average? And then she will kind of ease into it, and she might say on occasion, hey, that introduction it didn't quite land the way you wanted it to. Or she might communicate that it wasn't quite as funny as you thought, that, those kind of things. Or maybe that one thing that you said, I know what you meant, you wanted to go here, but it actually was going over there, and I didn't even realize it. And so what was my intention and my hope, she can have a radically different perspective on all. She edits everything I write, and so I'll have written a piece that I kind of like, and she'll be editing it, and she'll say, hey, this line doesn't make any sense. Are you trying to say this, or are you trying to say that? Because you're not saying really either. And help me understand what you're trying to say so we can make it just right. And such a benefit it is to me to have this other person, specifically a female here, because I write so much about those issues, to have somebody else that you know what I'm saying, that I can at least say, no, she approved it, like she's okay with it, right? And so I have this other person that's out there to help me and to assist me in the process. Communication is so difficult. Oh, think about what's happening between me and my wife at any given moment. Is I have these thoughts in my head, right? These thoughts that I want to communicate to her. And so I'm putting these words to these thoughts, and yet they're inadequate because I'm using just the words that we have. And let's face it, my language is a little bit limited, and so I don't have as many words that are available to some of you. And so I have just this limited language, and I try to come up with these words, and I speak these words, kind of like I'm doing now. I throw these words out here, and you hear some of them, not all of them. Other things are going on. You hear some of them, you hear most of them. It's just every now and then you might hear the word did when I said didn't, and that can change the meaning, just in every way possible. And so you're hearing most of them, and you're taking those words in and going by your history and your background with them, not my history and my background of how I meant the words, but you're taking your history and your background with those words, and you're putting them in your brain, and they're rattling around, and you're trying to understand what it is that I'm actually thinking. And then, if you want to talk back to me, that process reverses. And you're then taking your thoughts and putting them into your words and speaking them to me, and I'm hearing most of them, and I'm taking those and putting them into my brain based on the history that I have with the words and trying to figure out what it is that you're actually trying to say. And you know what? I have a news flash for you. Jenny and I don't always do that perfectly. And yet if we mess it up, what chance do you and I have? I mean, we love each other tremendously, spend a great deal of time together, work very diligently to try to figure out the heart and the understanding and the meaning of one another. What chance do you and I have to communicate in a God-honoring way? Communication is difficult. It's hard. So there's no wonder that we fail at it so often. And yet we know, because we looked at this series, we know the great danger that lies in that. Whenever we fail, that literally death can be in our words. We can kill the heart and the soul and the hope of other people. It's one of the great things that should scare us in the process of communication. Yet there is great hope for us because of what God has done on our behalf. Now we actually have the opportunity and the possibility to speak words of life into other people. And so we looked in the second week of how careful that we need to be to make sure that we speak the truth, to say those hard words, not in a harsh manner, not to use harsh words, but to say hard words, and how they can begin to draw people together in the midst of difficult communication. Last week, Stephen was with us, and we looked at those 7 deadly words that we need to stay away from, kind of giving us a guardrail of what it is that we need to say, the words that we actually need to use. And today, as we look at Proverbs 15 and verse number 28, and when in the midst of one verse, I think we can see what God's grace does to us in how we use our tongues. Listen to this verse. The heart of the righteous ponders how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours out evil things. Listen to it again. The heart of the righteous ponders how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours out evil things. As the writer of Proverbs, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, is now taking on almost the persona of a father, now writing to a child who's about to launch out into his own life. He draws a dichotomy, and in much the same way the book of Psalms does the same thing, between the godly and the ungodly. The writer of the book of Proverbs kind of creates a dichotomy between the righteous and the wicked. Now, there couldn't be 2 more extremes in these polar opposites in which he's trying to direct his son to say, go the way of righteousness, go the way of God. And so at times he's warning about the way of the wicked, at other times he's encouraging into the way of the righteous, and other times he's pointing out both, like he's doing here in this verse. And so as he draws this dichotomy, whenever it comes to speech, we can see the difference in actions and attitudes between a person who desires to be a follower of Jesus, who follows after him, and for us, whenever we think about righteousness, now that we've lived through the New Testament, through the cross, what this means, a righteous person is somebody whose God's grace has now touched us, not because of anything that we have done, any actions that we have done, but God's grace has now opened our eyes in faith, and now we desire to follow after him. So righteousness now is something God does for us, and it's in our response to what he's already done. Whereas the way of the wicked is the way that doesn't concern themselves with God, doesn't think about God, doesn't follow after God. And so the Father's pointing out these 2 drastically different ways. And whenever it comes to the words of the tongue, the Father says the way of the righteous and the way of the wicked are drastically different in that the way of the righteous, they ponder. Their heart ponders what to say, how to answer. Whereas the way of the wicked just pours out. Notice what it pours out. It just pours out evil. There's no restrictor plate on it. There's nothing slowing it down. It just oozes and oozes. Whatever it is that comes to mind, or the words that just begin to pour out of the wicked. And the result, because their heart is wicked, and in the same way that the heart is now begins to provide the words that we're actually going to say. And so the words are now a reflection of our own heart. And now what the wicked are pouring out are actually evil words. Well, what's the difference between the two? We can see radically different outcomes, righteousness and wickedness, a pouring out, a freely pouring out versus a pondering. Well, what's the difference between the two? The difference between the two is whether or not a heart has been touched by the love of God. That's the difference as we understand righteousness and wickedness. The only thing that makes me righteous is nothing that I've done, but God's love actually for me, which now begins to change my heart. Which as that changes my heart, I begin to walk in His righteousness. And what the Father is going to say here now, as I begin to walk in that, that's going to begin to restrict my words. There's a process that takes place. Whereas apart from God, apart from His love, I can just say whatever it is I want to say in the moment. And the byproduct is going to be evil, but I don't care, and I don't even recognize that. But once God's grace comes into my life, I begin to slow down and to ponder. It's all because of God, His great love for me. My heart has been changed now. I recognize that there is a God, whereas the wicked may not even realize that there is a God. And so there's no judgment. There's no concept of right or wrong. So they can say whatever it is that comes to their mind. But I, have been touched by God, understand that there is a higher power. There is a higher being, that one day I will give an account for the words that I actually say, which now begins to change my actions. But beyond that, I understand the creative order of God, that He actually loves us and has created us, which now means the people I'm speaking to, every ear that I now speak to is now honored by God, created by God, that it has value and a worth. And so whereas the wicked person would never consider the value of the person that they're speaking to, a Christian now would always consider that whoever sits across from them, whoever hears the words that they're actually saying now is loved by God and honored and cherished and valued. And now the words that I say, in part, not only am I speaking that to them, but God Himself is beginning to hear what I'm saying. And so I have to bring honor and glory to Him in the words that I actually say, which causes me to slow down, to think about it, and begin to ponder. But what is it that I'm pondering? Well, the text doesn't say. It doesn't make clear. It just says the wicked just doesn't pause in any way. They just pour out. It's evil. But the righteous ponders, but it doesn't say what we ponder. Well, in part, I think we can take the whole of the Bible and the biblical story, and what we're pondering, in part, is what's the loving thing to do here? With whoever's across from us, your ex-wife, your political opponent, the person that stabbed you in the back. That might all just be one person that I just described there, but whoever the other person is, whether it be a person you deeply love or a person you're trying to love, whoever that person is, what the righteous ponders is, how can I act in a loving way toward this person? And they begin to think, well, what are some things that we should consider with our speech? Well, maybe one thing we should consider is if we should speak it or not. Should we actually say something or not? This is something that will save us from a great deal of sorrow, because there are a lot of times in which we speak and we shouldn't. Now, there are also a lot of times in which we should speak and we don't. But the very first question is probably if we should. Do we have the relationship? Do we have the opportunity? Do we have the right and the God-given authority to speak truth in the midst of this situation? And if the answer is no, then chances are we don't need to speak. And so it removes you from the responsibility. Now, it's going to cause you to have to restrain because you're going to want to talk. And if you can't talk to the person, that means you probably can't talk to other people about it either. And yet it's a great freeing gift in that moment that you don't have the responsibility to right every wrong. Isn't that freedom? Like every grammatical mistake on Facebook, you don't have to correct. It's freeing. There's life that's within that restraint. If we should speak is one of the very first questions. What? If we are to speak, what are we to say? That's a great question. So often we just automatically assume that we know what we should say. And so we do a pretty good job of debating whether or not if we should speak, but we already know what we should say. But so often what we don't recognize is that we get the what wrong. Your child makes a mistake, and immediately you know what to say, you think. But is it possible that in that moment what your child doesn't need is correcting, but comfort? That maybe they already know that they're wrong. And what they don't need in that moment is another voice, especially the most authoritative voice within their life, now condemning them already again when they already know that. Maybe the what that we need to speak in the moment is to the relationship, not to the action, not to the specific activity, but to the relationship, and to make sure our child first and foremost knows that we love them. The what is so often overlooked, and yet it is within the what that so much is answered. Why is it that we feel such a compulsion to point out differences, but such an apathy to point out commonalities? Which one speaks more to you? I mean that there aren't times in which differences need to be spoken. Clearly there are. But far more often, especially in the midst of relationship, what we need to hear is, here's why we're on the same page. Here's why we love each other. Here's what's important to us. Yeah, we're going to get to these differences, but let's get to the important stuff first. It's very possible that you've been debating whether or not to speak to somebody, that maybe they've disappointed you, maybe they've done wrong by you in some way, and you're debating right now if you should speak, but you've never even considered what you should say. Maybe what you should say doesn't even have to do with the actual incident, but it calls to a higher purpose, a higher value, a higher commonality in what's going on. How's an important question. I think the righteous person ponders how to speak. It's not just what to say, but how do I actually go about it? What's the process by which I can best be heard? I think about this all the time with my kids. They make a mistake, and it does need to be corrected. I can't bypass it, and yet it's not a pressing thing in the moment. And yet so often, because I see it in the moment, I think the best time to correct it is in the moment, but they're not in the mindset to hear it in the moment. They're just as frustrated as I am. How am I going to go about saying that? Maybe I'm going to wait a little bit longer. Maybe I'm going to come at it from a different angle. Maybe I'm going to ask questions to see if they already know the truth of what's going on. Part of the question of how is when. What's the right time to actually answer? Notice just it's not going to be on the screen, but just 5 verses earlier from our text in verse 28, up in verse 23, notice what the text says. To make an apt answer is a joy to a man. So that's the right word at the right time. And a word in season, how good it is. A word in season, that's the question of when. It's a question of timing. Think about this. Some of the greatest words on the face of the planet are I love you, right? But even those words said at the wrong time are not effective. Imagine if you started feeling pain right now and it's appendicitis. We rush you to the hospital. And you get in there and they come and they run tests and they say, sure enough, you're going to have to do emergency surgery. And so they wheel you up into the surgical ward, and your doctor comes in, and he's going to meet you, and the anesthesiologist is there, and they're all hooked up, and you've never met these people in your entire life, and they're about to save your life. And as the anesthesiologist kind of pumps in the propofol to make you feel like Michael Jackson in the moment, as he pumps that into your veins, it's a great feeling. As he pumps that into your veins, you begin to count down 10, 9, 8, and you're only going to get to about 6. And that surgeon you've never met in your entire life leans over and whispers in your ear, I love you. Greatest words ever spoken, but only in the right season. Even the best words ever at the wrong time are wrong. If you doubt this, as soon as this service is over, if you've been holding it in and you're standing in the urinal in the men's restroom, try this. Look over to the guy next to you and say, hey, love you. Right words. That happened after first service to me, by the way. Right words in the wrong season. You know, the wicked person never even considers, is this the right time? Never even considers, should I speak or not? Never even considers, how should I say it in a way that's most loving toward this other person? Never even considers, what should I say in this moment? They just pour out whatever comes to their minds, and the result is evil. But the righteous person, their heart ponders how to answer. Think about this verse in the context of a very hotly debated topic in today's society. political correctness. Feel that phrase. Feel it for what are the emotions that come into your heart with that phrase. We live in what's described as a very politically correct time. And in part, what political correctness means is that we're going to elevate one's feelings above the truth. And so even if something is true, if it has the potential of hurting or offending somebody, we can't say it. And so it's possible that just within the last couple of years that the sermons of pastors in Houston were confiscated by government officials to see if what they're saying is not true or false, but offensive. It's possible that we live in a day in which the ultimate trump card is, hey, you hurt my feelings. When the truth is that sometimes the truth hurts. Sometimes we need the truth. Sometimes what I need from you more than anything is not a valuing of my feelings first and foremost, but a valuing of my heart to such an extent that you will risk the relationship, you will risk the good feelings, you will risk the good sentiment because you love me so much, you care for me so much that you will stand up and you will tell me the truth. In part, political correctness in our day is an elevating of a hurt over the elevating of a truth, and it's dangerous. But you know what's also true? We can't allow the pendulum to swing so far the other way. The church cannot allow the fact that some in our society want to restrict everything, even truth, in order to protect a feeling. We can't allow the pendulum to swing so far the other way that it now gives us a license and a liberty to be intentionally hurtful, grotesque, crude, or mean. Some would say, oh, well, you're just being too politically correct whenever you say it that way. I'm not being politically correct whenever I say something that way. I'm being kind and compassionate, trying to speak the truth in the right way. Ella was on the front row in the first service, so I couldn't say this, but I've had it said to us before, that whenever we say, the R word, it kind of hurts us in a way. We'd prefer you not use it. I had people say to me before, well, you're just being too politically correct. I don't want to be politically correct in my response to that. Refusing to use that word in reference to my daughter is not political correctness, it's kindness. Compassionate. It's not denying the truth. It's stating the truth in the most useful way. It's to begin to understand, you know what? Whenever I think about that word, I never thought about it in that context, but now that I hear that, I would never want to be injurious toward another person. This is part of the great beauty of the church family, and hopefully the diversity that's here, the different backgrounds and experiences. I have this meaning, these words have this meaning within my own life, and I don't even have an understanding of how they can mean anything else, and yet you come into my life with a different background, with a different experience, and you can say, hey, whenever you use this one word, here's what I hear. And I go, wow, I would have never thought about that. And then suddenly I get to choose, do I want to use that word or not? And for me, I would never want to dilute truth. And clearly we're called to speak truth in a loving and compassionate way, and we have to do so. And if the cross is an offensive message, then let people be offended by that message. But if there's a way that I can say something, and just in the uses of my words, I can say it in a less offensive way, I can say it to where I get a hearing from somebody else, then in that moment, there's no way I would use a word intentionally that caused great harm within your own life. If it meant nothing to me, there's no way I would risk the relationship. I would devalue you as a human being over something so petty, so unimportant as just some word that I use in the moment. By everything in my power, I would use the right word. And if by that's what we're talking about being politically correct, then that's being like Jesus. That didn't get a rousing round of applause there, did it? And you know what the truth is here? There is some who are using political correctness in a way to stifle down the truth, so much so that Christian colleges are having to debate whether or not they're going to proclaim the gospel and no longer get federal funds. And that's political correctness gone astray. But there's a great many number of our friends who, in response to that wrong, are creating our own wrong of saying, I'm no longer going to be like Jesus to stand up for my own rights. And that's equally grievous to our own hearts. You know why I love Jesus? He didn't just pour out words. He pondered them in the midst of his own perfection. And here's what that means to us. Everything Jesus says to us is true, is loving, is kind, is compassionate, and you can literally stand your life upon it. And so whenever he says, Kevin, you're a sinner, that is a hard truth that stings, and yet it's spoken in love. And I'm grateful that he had the courage to say it. Whenever he says, Kevin, I love you, that is an unbelievable truth that nothing can change. Whenever he says, Kevin, I forgive you, that is not something that he said in the moment just as a throwaway statement because he should. That's something that he spent from the very beginning of time itself preparing for. The words of God are forever true. Now, the gospel to us, it changes how we communicate. It causes us to ponder and not just pour out, to say hard things and not just harsh things, to choose words of life and not to choose words of death. But here's the truth. It's always going to be messy. Until we see Jesus again, it's always going to be messy. Because my heart is sin-filled and your heart is sin-filled, and we live in this fallen, this broken world. And yet the gospel changes us. The gospel in part, one thing that it means, the gospel in part, what that means to me is that I'm not going to be so easily offended. Because of the gospel within my life, you can't easily offend me. Because even if you have the intention of hurting me, I can pray, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they say. In the same way that Jesus prayed that, they know not what they do. It means I have compassion on you, and I know so often your words come from your own hurt and aren't a definition now of my own heart. It means that no matter what you say, it doesn't compare to what God has already said about me, and my life is built not on what you say about me, but what God himself says about me, which means I'm not as easily offended. And the gospel also means that I'm going to do everything in my power not to offend you if I don't have to. That yes, I will speak truth, and yes, I will have the compulsion, the conviction from the Holy Spirit to say things that might injure our relationship forever. But whenever I do so, I'm going to make sure that they're based on truth, and I'm going to make sure that they're said in the most loving way possible as a possibility to give you an opportunity to change. But if there's these other things in which it really doesn't matter, then I'm not going to use words that are offensive to you and hurtful to you. I'm going to do everything in my power to do this right, and I'm going to go out of my way to not be offensive. And yet in the midst of all of it, the gospel begins to tell me that we are fallen people that live in a fallen world, and we are going to mess this up every single day. And whenever we do, we're going to have to come to one another and ask for forgiveness. We're going to be quick to admit our imperfections, admit our need, and in the midst of the messiness and the brokenness of our own communication, it should cause us to long for heaven even more. Because every wrong word, every hurtful word, every word that we later regret or we wish somebody else wouldn't have said is just another sign and signal that we live in a fallen world that is in desperate need of Jesus. And one day, with a shout, he's going to come back to this earth and make everything else right. But until that day, with these fallen and broken tongues, we have to continue to praise him and bring glory to him and figure out a way to communicate to one another. You want to know how to communicate God's way? Let every word that you say be loving toward the person that you're speaking to. That does it all. Would you bow your heads in prayer with me?